June in the desert. The sun roars down from its track in space with a savage and holy light, a fantastic music in the mind. Up in the mountains, the snow has receded to timberline. Old Tukanikavats and the other peaks take on a soft spring green along the flanks. The aspen is leafing out. The roads up into the meadows and forests are open again, and all the Moab cattlemen who hold grazing permits up there, and some who don't, are moving their stock out of the desert and into the national forest, where the animals will stay until September and the return of the snow. Springtime on the mountains, summer down here. Yesterday, I helped Roy clear his cows out of Courthouse Wash, which runs mostly to the west of the park and through the south end of it. We started early, about 6, after a hot breakfast in the morning twilight. 3 of us, Roy, his Basque hired man Viviano Jaques, myself. Roy is a leather-hided, long-connected, sober-sided old man with gray hair, red nose, and yellow teeth. He is kind, gentle, well-meaning, but worries too much, takes things too seriously. For instance, he's afraid of having a heart attack, falling off the horse, dying there on the sand, under the sun, among the flies and weeds and indifferent cattle. I'm not inferring this. He told me so. What could I say? I was still young myself, or thought I was, enjoying good health. Not yet quite to the beginning of the middle of the journey. I listened gravely as he spoke of death, nodding in an agreement I did not feel. His long yellow fingers, holding a cigarette, trembled. Roy's no Mormon, and not much of a Christian, and does not honestly believe in an afterlife. Yet the manner of death he fears does not sound bad to me. To me it seems like a decent, clean way of taking off. Surely better than the slow rot in a hospital oxygen tent, with rubber tubes stuck up your bodily orifices, with blood transfusions and intravenous feeding, bed sores and bedpans and bad-tempered nurses' aides, the whole nasty routine to which most dying men in our time are condemned. But how could I tell him so? What did I know of it? To me, death was little more than a fascinating abstraction, the conclusion to a syllogism, or the denouement of a stage drama. What do old men who don't believe in heaven think about? I used to wonder. Now we know. They think about their blood pressure, their bladders, their aortas, their lower intestines, ice on the doorstep, too much sun at noon. But so do the others. I met Roy and Viviano at a place called Willow Seep, near the upper end of Courthouse Wash, and there we began the drive. We were only about 10 miles from the stock pens near Moab, but would have to check out all the side canyons along the way. We unloaded the horses from Roy's truck, gave them each a little grain, saddled up, and moved out with the old man in the middle. A fine morning, a sweet, cool, stark, sunlit, silent desert morning, before the heat moved in, and the deer flies, the sweat, the dust, and the thirst came down on us. Not far down the canyon, we found the first small bunch of cows and calves. They saw us coming and trotted off in various directions through the brush, making things more difficult than really necessary. In the cool of the morning, they were feeling lively. Also, not having seen a man or horse all winter, they were half wild. The little calves had never seen anything like us and were understandably terrified. We collected them all after a time and got them moving together down the wash, pushing them steadily but not fast. Only half the cows wore Roy's brand and earmarks, but in accordance with custom, we herded everything we found toward Moab. The other ranchers would do the same, and in the stock pens each man would sort out his own property from the rest. Any cow without a brand, slick, belonged to the finder. Many a famous cattle outfit had been started with no more than a rope and a good horse. Cooperation is necessary because in this part of Utah there are not many fences. The cattle wander far over the open range, driven by hunger and thirst, and forget who they belong to. Why no fences? Because in much of the canyon country there's no ground to dig post holes in, nothing but solid rock. Old Roy had something on his mind. When the sun burst out above the canyon rim, flaring like a white scream, and its hot breath burned my neck, I knew what he was thinking about. The cattle plodded before us, slowing down as the heat rose, reluctant to keep moving. When they stopped, we yelled and whistled at them, beat their gaunt hip bones with our bridle reins, kicked them in the ribs. They jogged ahead, half-trotting, and the green dung streamed down their legs. Ugly brutes, bound for a summer in the high meadows and then the slaughterhouse. Too bloody good for them, I was thinking. Side canyons appeared. Viviano took one, I took the other, while Roy stayed with the bunch we already had. The canyon I faced was choked with brush, impossible to ride through. The prickly pear grew knee-high in great clumps, hairy with spines. Scrub oak obstructed the path. The branches of juniper and pinyon pine struck at my face, knocked my hat off. I had to tie the horse and go in on foot. The heavy air was swarming with flies, and the numerous trails in the thickets were well beaten and dusty, strewn with cow droppings. Real cattle country, all right. I picked up a club, went on, stooping under the tangle. The canyon was short and boxed in, and at the head was a cow and her calf. I drove them out and back to the main canyon. I was glad to get on my horse and rejoin Viviano and Roy. Viviano was happy that morning. He sang and whistled continually, winked and grinned when he caught my eye, and charged after straying cattle like a maniac, spurring his thin-skinned palomino through the brush, up over rocks, down mud banks, and between trees, with what looked to me like complete indifference to life and limb, the vulnerability of the flesh. Not showing off, for I'd seen his exhibitions of recklessness at other times, but simply out of high spirits for the fun and the hell of it. Viviano Jaques, born in the Pyrenees somewhere, he never cared to tell me more, had been imported with his parents into Utah to herd sheep for some congressman's favorite constituent, then drifted from job to job until he came to Roy Scobie's combination dude and cattle ranch. He's a good cowboy, I suppose. At least he knows the basic skills of the trade, can shoe a horse, rope and brand and castrate a calf, fix a flat tire, stretch barbed wire, dynamite a beaver dam, or lay out an irrigation ditch. His English is about 50% profanity, rough but intelligible, and he could sing, play the guitar, read your fortune in the cards, the rewards of what I would call his liberal education. He is short, dark, and savage, like most good Basques, with large, brown, glamorous eyes that seem to appeal to the ladies. From 13 to 35 he pursues them all, and if I can believe his lies, makes out with every one. What else about him? This: he does not understand American clock time, and has no sense of responsibility. He is completely and dependably, totally unreliable. But in his favor, he is inexpensive, he is economical. He works full-time, 7 days a week for room and board and $100 a month. Employers like that. But it would be false to say that Viviano is exploited. How can you exploit a man who enjoys his work? He'll work for nothing, almost, if necessary, requiring only a token wage or salary in recognition of his professional status. Not that he never bitches and grumbles. When he isn't singing or whistling or telling lies in some woman's ear, he complains loud and bitterly about his pay, the long hours, the lousy food, the skunks under the bunkhouse, the treacherous and conniving women, the stupid dudes. He threatens to quit, gets drunk, and disappears for a couple of days, but always comes back, or has so far. Poor Viviano, with so much to his credit, has one problem which he'll never be able to outlive: 2 or 3 beers, and he reveals it to me. He has been infected by the poison of prejudice. Infected and victimized. With his dark skin and Spanish accent, he's often taken for a Mexican, which he resents because he despises Mexicans. He also despises Indians, even his own heritage. Dumb Basco, he once called himself. Inadvertently, when drunk, he exposes the wistful desire to somehow disappear and merge into the pale-faced millions who own and operate America. Useless to try and reassure him that he has more to lose than gain by such assimilation. Somewhere, in a way we all know, his pride was damaged and his confidence shaken. In our occasional rambles through the beer halls of Moab, I have not seen him rebuffed in any way, but he may be alert to signals of rejection too subtle for me. In any case, at one time or another, perhaps unknown even to Viviano himself, the damage was done. And his reaction is the typical one. He responds to prejudice by cultivating a prejudice of his own against those whom he feels are even lower in the American hierarchy than he is, against the Indians, the Mexicans, the Negroes. He knows where the bottom is. Too late to make a liberal out of Viviano Jaques. The sun climbed noon high. The heat grew thick and heavy on our brains. The dust clouded our eyes and mixed with our sweat. Viviano's white teeth gleam through a kind of pancake makeup of sweat and dirt when he laughs at me or at the hard-mouthed beast I'm riding. The cows groan against the forced migration, as if they know where it will eventually bring them. I think of the second movement from Beethoven's Eroica, Marcia Funebre. My canteen is nearly empty, and I'm afraid to drink what little water is left. There may never be any more. I'd like to cave in for a while, crawl under yonder cottonwood, and die peacefully in the shade, drinking dust. I look aside covertly under my hat brim at old man Scobie, who thinks he's going to have a heart attack and fall off his horse. He rides steadily forward, eyes sad and thoughtful, watching the green rumps of his cattle, cigarette hanging from his lower lip, flicking the reins casually back and forth across the mane of his equally thoughtful, abstracted horse. Lunchtime, maybe, I think, glancing at the sun. But nobody says anything about lunch. Some of the cows bunched up in the shade under an overhang in the canyon wall. They refused to move. Their calves stumbled close to them, bawling piteously. The drive was starting to drag. Have mercy on us all, I thought. But Viviano, like a sun-crazed madman, rode savagely into the cattle, screaming and whistling, lashing at the cows with a length of rope. Crazy son of a bitches, he was screaming, let's pick up the feet. Roy raised a hand. Viviano, he said, we'll take a break now. Don't want to run them little beeves right into the ground. Good man, I thought, heading at once for the nearest shade, where I tied my horse to a log, unsaddled, and dropped. I was too hot and tired at first even to care about food or water. Viviano and Roy joined me, unhurried, lay down in the shade nearby, and lit up cigarettes. Above us was the green canopy of the cottonwood tree, filtering the light to a tolerable dimness. A few red ants crawled over my belly. I didn't care. Tengo said, I said to myself. I finished my water, but appeasing thirst brought back hunger. Who brought the lunch? I began to worry, realizing for the first time that no one had said a word about it yet. I didn't say anything either, but I was worried. I'm worried, old Roy said. Tengo mucho hambre, hombre. I'm worried too. How did it go in that other language? Femme, je suis femme. I looked toward Viviano. He was already asleep, the fancy $20 Stetson over his eyes, a pair of flies circling above his open mouth. For a hatband he wore a sterling silver chain. In the mouth, a golden tooth. The goddamn lady killer. You know what happened to Ernie Fay? Roy said, evidently addressing me, though he was staring up at the leaves. No, I said. What happened to him? You wouldn't know him. This happened 3 years ago. Roy paused. He was picking peaches one day in his own backyard, taking it easy, and he had a stroke. When his wife went out to look for him, he was on the ground on top of a bushel basket, and he was dead. A big, strong man, too. 66 years old. That's for a fact. It happens. Did you bring any lunch, Roy? Lunch? He continued to stare at nothing, thinking, worrying. 66 years old, he said. It happens, but only once. Once is enough. Did you bring any lunch? Lunch? At last he turned his head to look at me. Well, no, I didn't. Are you hungry? A little bit, now that you mention it. Sorry we didn't bring anything. We'll eat good when we get back. That's all right, I said. I'll survive, maybe. But Roy had lost interest in the subject. He wasn't listening to me. The vacant look was in his eyes as he resumed the study of his problem. After a while, he let his head drop back against his saddle and closed his eyes. The red nose, the gray hair, the yellow teeth and fingers, the white stubble of whiskers on his bony jaw, his leathery, flat cheeks. He looked like an old horse, all right, but still tough and viable. He was only about 70 years old. Old Roy is a good man in most ways, but he has his troubles. I've been spending some of my days off at his ranch, doing a little work around the place in return for room and board. There's a girl there, one of the paying guests. I was sharing a bunkhouse room with Viviana one night when I heard the shuffling of feet, the sound of a mumbling voice. It was very late. Viviana was sound asleep. I got up and stepped outside and saw Roy walking by in his long underwear and boots, a revolver in his hand, talking to himself. What's up? I asked him. Insomnia, he said. I said, try getting a little sleep. I tried, he said, and I can't. What's the gun for? Skunks, he said. They've been at the chickens again. Well, there are no chickens here, I said. No, but there's skunks, and they're living right under that room where you're sleeping. And he walked away, unhappy and preoccupied. He has troubles, God knows. He fights with his wife, third or fourth wife, and has difficulties with the bank, with his horses, with his hired help, with the ranch machinery. Mortgaged over his head, he tries to economize by getting by with old trucks and a second-hand tractor, and by hiring cheap and irresponsible help like me and Viviano. He thinks he's saving money by always paying Viviano 1 month late. Worst of all, he skips on food. His pack trips are notorious for their frugality. He does the cooking, of course, so that someone else is morally obliged to wash the dishes, and so that he can control the consumption of supplies. 1 egg or 2, he'll ask at breakfast time, when you're hungry enough to eat the skin off a bear. Slowly, his old yellow hands shaking, he shovels 2 little grade C eggs onto your plate, and then he says, you want any bacon with that? He tries to justify his miserliness with food by pretending that he's observing some time-honored Western tradition. It's a fact, he'll claim. Them old-timers never ate much when they was out working on the range. A man rides better on a hard stomach. It's a fact. But we'll eat good when we get back. The lying old bastard. He hopes that by starving his employees they won't live long enough to collect their wages. The paying guests don't fare much better, and as a result seldom come back for a second season at Roy Scobie's Red Rock Ranch. It's a beautiful ranch, and his pack trips take them into an unknown world, but they don't often return. As a small businessman, Roy is getting smaller every season. Bankruptcy and heart attacks loom ahead. I've endeavored to warn him. He's interested in my opinion, and listens at first with some care. Then his attention wanders. The habits of a lifetime are impossible to break. When we bed down at night, out in the open, he always looks for a slab of sandstone to spread his bedroll on. Rock is softer than sand, he explains. That's for a fact. His words trail off into the vague mumble. Slept on rock all my life, God damn it. The empty stare follows. A foolish thrift is driving him to ruin. and all he cares about is his heart. He's thinking about falling off his horse again, like Ernie Fay fell off the ladder picking peaches, dead on the rock. I can help him with that question, too, I sometimes think. I have a supply of classic philosophical lore ready to offer at the slightest provocation. Our life on earth is but the shadow of a higher life, I could tell him. Or life is but a dream. Or who wants to live forever? Vanity, vanity. Recall Sophocles, Roy. Lucky are those who die in infancy, but best of all is never to have been born, you know. All kinds of ideas spring to mind, but an instinctive prudence makes me hold my tongue. What right have I to interfere with an old man's anti-death wish? He knows what he's doing. Let him savor it to the full. He'll never have another chance as good as this. Each man in his humor. Every cobbler gets clobbered at last, and so forth. Let him shamble through the dark at night in his underwear, looking for the black skunk with a white stripe down its back, the ultimate enemy. The weird silence woke me up. I looked around. Everything seemed to be withering in the heat, blasted and shrunken under the furnace of the sun. I dreamed of water and wondered if it would be worth the effort to dig a hole through this ceramic mud of the canyon floor. While I debated the matter in my head, Roy opened his eyes, staggered up, glanced blearily at me to see that I was awake, nudged Viviano in the ribs with the toe of his boot. "Let's get on, boys," he said. We saddled our horses and got on with the death march, Marcia Funebre, the stations of the cross, El Hornado del Muerto. The cows faced us stubbornly, their red eyes full of hatred. The poor little white-faced calves trembled on their shaky legs, hides coated with dust, hind ends crusted with sun-baked excrement. Roy moved his horse stolidly against them, implacable. Viviano, undaunted by the heat and still showing off, sprang on his horse, yes, literally vaulted into the saddle, and rode yelling and flailing and whistling into the herd. One leap and he was in the saddle, 5 beers and he was on the floor. I climbed onto my horse like a man dragging himself through a bad dream, got both feet in the stirrups and rode after the others. After a few minutes of milling struggle, the weary beasts gave up and headed down the canyon, moving in the right direction toward their fate. Not that their fate was so terrible. A summer in the high mountain meadows eating flowers, far above the heat and hay fever of the desert. I envied them. The cows would live to breed again, those that didn't eat too much larkspur. The new crop of calves had a life expectancy of at least 1 full year. Only the yearling steers would be shipped off in the fall to meet the hook and the hammer. I nursed my sympathies, saving them chiefly for myself, who could better appreciate them and deserve them more, hungry, tired, dirty, and thirsty as I was. More side canyons came into view, 2 Mile, Sleepy Hollow, and others without names, and we had to separate, explore each one in search of the outlaws and the fugitives, drive them out of the thickets where they were shaded up, and add them to the herd. There's water in Sleepy Hollow, a big pool under a seep in the canyon wall, fenced off from the cows. We paused for a few minutes to drink and refill canteens, then moved on. No time for a swim today. The drive continued. As the herd became bigger, the dust and the heat got worse. The cattle complained, but we were merciless. One old cow, followed by her calf, slipped aside into the tamarisk and lay down. Since she was on my flank of the drive, I had to get her out. Again, I had to dismount and go in on foot, fighting my way through the brush and clouds of gnats and the vicious yellow-backed flies. The cow didn't want to get up. She preferred the shade. I beat her with a club, kicked her in the ribs, yanked at her tail. At last, groaning and farting with exaggerated self-pity, she hoisted her rear end, then her front end, and plodded off to rejoin the gang. When I got back to my horse, I was too tired to climb immediately into the saddle. It seemed easier for a while to walk and lead the horse. Second movement, Seventh Symphony, Beethoven again, the slow, ponderous dirge. Had the sun moved at all? Not that I could tell. But as I came up with the others, Viviano, grinning through his dusty face, yelled at me, "Around the bend, only 9 son of a bitch more, we get to Jesus Christ out of here." Good, I said, but something in my face must have given me away. Viviano laughed, spurred his horse, and dashed off, singing. I parked my beast for a minute close to a mud bank and hauled myself onto the saddle the easy way, but dropped the reins and nearly fell off retrieving them, recovered. Both feet in stirrups, I took a few gulps of water and proceeded. Puddles of quicksand lay ahead of us. We drove the herd around to the side, but one cow, stubborn and stupid, managed to get into the stuff. Deliberately, I was sure. The sand quivered like jelly beneath the cow's hooves, broke open, sucked at the plunging feet. Panicked, the cow struggled through, splashing mud and sand. Safe. As we went on, I looked back and saw the holes the cow had made fill up and brim over with water like suppurating sores. More quicksand. This time we weren't so lucky. The pool extended clear across the canyon floor from one sheer wall to the other. We rushed the herd through, but one cow, the same one as before, got herself bogged down. Really trapped this time. Belly deep in the soup, willing to give up, she neither struggled nor bellowed. This cow didn't want to fight anything anymore. The sun beat down on our backs and the sweat trickled into our eyes. Roy and Viviano discussed the situation briefly. We went to work. Keeping their mounts clear of the quicksand, they each tossed a loop over the cow's head, drew the knot firm around her neck, taking in the slack, and dallied each rope to the horns of their saddles. As the ropes tautened and the horses prepared to pull, I slogged into the mud and tugged at the cow's tail to give her hindquarters whatever lift I could. We were ready. Roy and Viviano urged their horses forward. The horses squatted, braced, heaved. The ropes squeaked under the strain. For a moment nothing seemed to be happening. Then something was happening. Like a cork from a bottle, the cow was being drawn from the suction of the quicksand. She struggled feebly. The horses swung ahead. The mud made a violent, raw, gasping noise, exploded, and out she came. Roy and Viviano stopped and gave me some slack. I removed the ropes from the cow's neck as she stood trembling on firm ground. Her eyeballs protruded like a pair of onion bulbs. The tongue, purple in hue and coated with scum, hung loosely from the side of her mouth like a rag of spoiled meat. It was the longest tongue I'd ever seen outside of a butcher's shop. $70 worth of cow, Roy explained, coiling his rope. As a fact, I couldn't hardly afford to leave it there. The cow had still not moved. Viviano rode up and lashed it across the rump. "Hee-haw," he shouted. "Let's go, man. Jesus Christ." The cow stumbled toward the herd. Viviano pressing it hard. "Hee-haw, goddamn," whacking it across the rear with his heavy, wet rope. "Goddamn son of a bitch cow." The herd began to move. The choking dust filled the air. I climbed on my horse, loading the poor brute down not only with my own weight, but with 2 bootfuls of mud and water. An hour later, we descended the jump-off, a stairway of stone ledges in the canyon floor, where trickles of water oozed down over mats of alga, through slick, sculptured grooves and into the sandy basins below. The cattle clattered and skidded on the bare rock. Sparks flew from the iron-shod hooves of the horses. Lagging behind, I stopped to admire a tiny spring bubbling out of the sand above the ledges, well off to one side of the trail. The water was so clear, so perfectly transparent, that only the dance of grains of sand in the bottom of the spring, where the flow came up through a fissure in the rock, revealed that it was under pressure and in motion. I took a quick drink, cool and sweet. and rode on through the blessed shade of the canyon walls. The sun had finally dropped below the rim. Life began to seem plausible again after an afternoon of doubt. We went on for another mile and emerged abruptly and to me unexpectedly into full day again, the glare of the sun and the scalding heat. We were in the mouth of the canyon. Ahead lay the highway, the Colorado River, the outskirts of Moab. We pushed the cattle on over the bridge, across the cement and asphalt, and into the big corrals in the fields beyond. We unsaddled the horses and brushed them and turned them loose in the pasture. Free at last, frolicking like colts, they galloped after one another in circles, lay down and rolled in the dust, got up and galloped some more. I knew how they felt. Roy's truck was parked near the stock pens. We adjourned the field for a pitcher of beer in Moab. It was, of course, only the usual Mormon 3.2, for which may God forgive them, but never had beer tasted better or been drunk by more deserving men. Old Roy treated us each to a bag of peanuts and talked a little about tomorrow's work, trucking the cattle up to his allotment on the southern slope of Tukanikavats. A tedious job in which I would not participate. Back to the Arches for me, I reminded him. Roy's expression saddened. He would have to hire someone to take my place for the day, someone who would probably expect to be paid in United States hard dollars. He looked away and into the emptiness, thinking again. The smoke from his forgotten cigarette rose slowly into the haze beneath the ceiling. "Stop that," I wanted to tell him. "Stop that thinking." I wanted to put my arm around his old shoulders and stroke his thin gray hair and tell him the truth about everything, the entire wild, beautiful, utterly useless truth. But I didn't. Viviano ordered a second pitcher of beer, got up suddenly from his chair, tripped over my outstretched legs, and fell flat on the floor. He pulled himself slowly to his feet and scowled about through the gloom to see if anyone had noticed. Nobody had. Nobody could have cared less. I should have apologized and helped him get up, but I didn't. He tramped bitterly, soggily towards the men's room and disappeared in a dim, rancid, yellowish light. He was a cowboy, muy macho, mucho hombre, very sensitive. Years later, still wandering in circles, I will come back to the Arches and the canyon country and inquire about my old acquaintances. "Where are they?" I will ask, and the people will say to me, "Viviano Hawkes? You mean that little Mexican that worked for Roy Scobie? Well, who knows? Some say he went to Ouray, Colorado, to work in a silver mine. Some say he married Scobie's cook, that white girl from Oklahoma, and they went to California. Some say he went back to sheep herding. Some say he went to Spain. And old Roy? You didn't hear? Well, he had to sell out a couple years after you left. He went down to Arizona and started an Indian jewelry store near Sedona. He's dead now. He was hanging a picture on the wall of his store and had a heart attack. He was standing on a chair at the time." But so do the others. I met Roy and Viviano at a place called Willow Seep near the upper end of Courthouse Wash, and there we began the drive. We were only about 10 miles from the stock pens near Moab, but would have to check out all the side canyons along the way. We unloaded the horses from Roy's truck, gave them each a little grain, saddled up, and moved out with the old man in the middle. A fine morning. A sweet, cool, stark, sunlit, silent desert morning before the heat moved in and the deer flies, the sweat, the dust, and the thirst came down on us. Not far down the canyon, We found the first small bunch of cows and calves. They saw us coming and trotted off in various directions through the brush, making things more difficult than really necessary. Are open again, and all the Moab cattlemen who hold grazing permits up there, and some who don't, are moving their stock out of the desert and into the national forest, where the animals will stay until September and the return of the snow. Springtime on the mountains, summer down here. Yesterday, I helped Roy clear his cows out of Courthouse Wash, which runs mostly to the west of the park and through the south end of it. We started early, about 6, after a hot breakfast in the morning twilight. 3 of us, Roy, his Basque hired man Viviano Jaques, myself. Roy is a leather-hided, long-connected, sober-sided old man with gray hair, red nose, and yellow teeth. He's off. Surely better than the slow rot in a hospital oxygen tent, with rubber tubes stuck up your bodily orifices, with blood transfusions and intravenous feeding, bed sores and bedpans and bad-tempered nurses' aides, the whole nasty routine to which most dying men in our time are condemned. But how could I tell him so? What did I know of it? To me, death was little more than a fascinating abstraction, the conclusion to a syllogism, or the denouement of a stage drama. What do old men who don't believe in heaven think about? I used to wonder. Now we know. They think about their blood pressure, their bladders, their aortas, their lower intestines, ice on the doorstep, too much sun at noon. He is kind, gentle, well-meaning, but worries too much, takes things too seriously. For instance, he's afraid of having a heart attack, falling off the horse, dying there on the sand, under the sun, among the flies and weeds and indifferent cattle. I'm not inferring this. He told me so. What could I say? I was still young myself, or thought I was, enjoying good health. Not yet quite to the beginning of the middle of the journey. I listened gravely as he spoke of death, nodding in an agreement I did not feel. His long yellow fingers, holding a cigarette, trembled. Roy's no Mormon, and not much of a Christian, and does not honestly believe in an afterlife. Yet the manner of death he fears does not sound bad to me. To me it seems like a decent, clean way of taking. June in the desert. The sun roars down from its track in space with a savage and holy light, a fantastic music in the mind. Up in the mountains, the snow has receded to timberline. Old Tukanikavats and the other peaks take on a soft spring green along the flanks. The aspen is leafing out. The roads up into the meadows and forests